Hello friends! With the Procreate 5.4 update, there are now even more incredible default brushes to choose from, and we're going to explore some of them. In this video, I'm going to try a digital colored pencil drawing with the Lofty brush. To find this brush, head to the brush library, and we're in the new Procreate library. You're going to open up the pencil set, and about halfway down the list is Lofty. As always, I've made no changes in the brush studio, and I'll be using the brush exactly as it was installed. And I also have my canvas set to 3000 pixels square at 300 dpi. Let's first take a look at the brush behaviors, and to start, let's test the stroke at a small, medium, and large size. Now, the first thing I notice is that there's not a huge range in stroke sizes. Now, this makes sense given that it is a pencil brush. There's a limit to the size of traditional pencils, so it makes sense that there would be a size limit here as well. There is some decent texture with this brush, which you can see at pretty much every size. It's pretty consistent in terms of how the texture appears along the stroke. And with a pencil brush like this, you do want to see at least a little bit of texture because it will mimic how the color or graphite shows up on actual paper. The brush is pressure sensitive, but only slightly. You can see that you'll get a lighter value when you apply less pressure and more dense color when you apply more pressure. There is a very slight change in stroke width as well, but again, it's not a huge shift. And I can see that the brush has a little bit of a taper as well. All right, I'm going to put down a few swatches of color so that we can test the opacity. Of course, since the brush size doesn't get super big, this requires a little bit more work. Now, as you would expect with a pencil brush, it's pretty opaque. You get decent coverage, even light color over dark. I do notice that it can appear semi-transparent in some areas, like you're seeing a little of that blue below, but that's dependent on how you apply the color. So for example, if you're light and loose with the application, then there are more spaces between the strokes and the color below will show through. But if you cover an area with tight, compact strokes, and they're really close together, then no color will show through. And this feels very true to how traditional color pencils work, where you'd get a more dense, vibrant color when you burnish and apply lots of pressure to fill the tooth of the paper. All right, let's see what happens when I change my grip and use the side of the pencil. The texture is definitely more prominent, but it's not too gritty. The grain is fairly soft and smooth. Now I'm going to long press on the smudge tool, so that is also switched to Lofty. Okay, so it's smoothing out the texture when you go along the grain. So I drew these swatches with vertical stroke marks, and it's not really doing that much when I blend vertically in the same direction as the stroke marks. But the smudging becomes a little bit more obvious if you blend, I guess you can call it, against the grain. So if I go on a diagonal, then you can see the color kind of bleeding into the blue there. The smudging effect is also a lot more obvious if you just do it along the edges. When that would come in handy, don't know, but it's an observation. By the way, if you'd like to use this same process for testing your brushes at home, I made a brush testing worksheet for you. There's a link in the description for the free download. Okay, let's test this brush with an actual drawing. I'm going to draw a sweet little bird, so I started with a framework of basic shapes, and now I'm using those shapes to build out my sketch. I decided to outline different sections in the same colors I will eventually use for those areas. As we discovered earlier during the brush behaviors test, the maximum stroke size of this brush isn't that large, so it's going to take a lot of work to fill large areas with color. So I'm going to start by using the side of the pencil to quickly fill this area with a base color. Now I can go in with individual strokes to define those sections. I don't want the color to be too smooth though. I want those stroke marks to be visible, so it looks like I've done this with a pencil. So I'm changing the direction of my strokes to keep that hand-drawn look. I've got a lot of ground to cover, so I'm using an even looser technique here. The strokes are longer and further apart. In the reference photo I'm working from, the feathers switch to a lighter color around this area, so I'm just blocking in where the orange will transition to yellow. I'm going to follow that same technique with these blue areas as well. I'm working on separate layers, by the way. The framework sketch, the refined sketch, the yellow and orange sections, this section, they're all on their own layers. When I'm experimenting like this, I like to have that safety net so that if I screw something up, I can just rework that one layer without affecting everything else. I'm trying a little hatching here to make this area more dense while still keeping the individual strokes visible. All right, let's define the shape of this beak and then fill with color. I'm also going to add a lighter blue for some highlight. And I'll layer on more of the darker blue to make this area nice and dense. Okay, back to filling this area with the lighter blue. And I'm just going to take my time using these loose strokes at first. Then I'll go back over it with another layer or maybe two. To define some of the feathers, I'm starting with a few strokes in a darker color. Then I'll add the lighter blue over that base color and those lines. Now I can go in with more deliberate, thicker strokes to indicate those feathers, and I'll use those lines that I made earlier as a guide. Here I'm using short strokes and a couple different blues to create some texture in this area around the eye. I'll use a similar technique here as well. Okay, the orange areas are done now, so I'll add the yellow in this area where the lightest feathers are, and I'm doing this on a layer above the orange. As I'm adding detail to the eye, it's striking me that although the stroke size of this brush can get really small, it's actually a little challenging to get really crisp lines. Fortunately, it's not all that noticeable when you zoom out. All right, I don't want this video to get too long, so I'll just show snippets of how the rest of the illustration came together. I basically started everything with an outline or a basic shape, then went back in to sketch out the details, filled with color, and then added shading. With these thin lines, I found that I had to go over them a few times in order for them to stand out, even though this is a fairly opaque brush. I'm guessing that was because of the light color, because these darker strokes showed up just fine. Okay, the last thing I want to do is test out a couple different background colors. Nope. No. Maybe. I wonder what a dark background would look like. You can really see that dark background color show through in areas like this where I didn't add tons of layers of color. But in areas like this, where I was more intentional about adding more layers and keeping my strokes really nice and tight, the color is completely opaque and really nice and vibrant, actually. I don't mind the dark background, but I think I'll stick with a lighter color. Okay, final thoughts about this brush. The first thing that really sticks out to me is how soft and creamy this brush is. To me, it feels softer than drawing with any of the really good quality traditional color pencils I've tried. So although you can achieve a colored pencil look, I don't necessarily think it feels like drawing with colored pencil. That's not a deal breaker for me personally, but I mention it in case that's something that's important to you. I found the brush easy to draw with, and I really like the color vibrancy you can achieve. Now, because it's so soft and creamy, it was slightly challenging to get really crisp lines for fine details. But again, I didn't feel like that was a huge problem. Overall, I thought it did a great job, and it gave me the result I was hoping for. How do you think this brush performed? I'd love to hear your thoughts, especially if you typically work with traditional colored pencils. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let me know what you think. If you'd like to see more from this brush review series, there's a link to the playlist in the description. And if you enjoyed this video, I'd love if you'd give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.